So these are communities that know each other. These are not huge areas. But this is a pattern that actually would be very interesting to see if it is replicated, right? You drive people out through fear, and you get the leaders to run first. I won't go through examples of all of this, but we have parameters, indicators for various kinds of warfighting, and this is actually pretty robust from the IR literature already, because this is the sort of things that the social scientists have been studying. A lot of detail through the political scientists and the genocide scholars and human rights people on this last bullet about parameters and indicators. We just need to find ways of seeing them in real life, empirically, in real time. So I'm going to do a brief example of Darfur for a moment, and because I was involved in a study that was on in 2004, also other studies, but showing how we used a variety of different forms of information and methods to try to get to a sense of what was going on. This is a familiar document to many of you. Many of you were involved in making it. And we were in this town of Towisha and asked people, this is a 2004-05 study, asked people to draw what happened in their village. You all know this. Local people, particularly the men, are very good at maps usually. Certainly people who have to live on the land and move around in it. And so essentially what they said was that the attackers came this way, a linear attack, which fit all of the testimony that all the human rights and humanitarian people were saying was going on. And the early refugees were also saying they came from one end and they went through the village. So what they did is they burned these places. Here's where people were killed. This is where people were buried. And this is the route out. And so this is where people fled. And here's where the mass grave is, actually. We basically then did we took a map of Furwea that was engaged in the same way, and we put it in a graphic so that we had a sense of where the animals were, where the houses were, where the major buildings were. And this is, again, the road that goes through these villages. The attack came at one side. Photograph taken that I use for teaching purposes at Harvard, and a lot of people are a little slow on it, but this, again, is pattern recognition. You see camels coming back at the end of a day, woman pulling this one, they're always reluctant, and they've got this much firewood on them. So I asked Harvard kids, is that all a camel can carry? And actually, some of them aren't so aware that a camel could actually carry about that much, right? So the point comes in that this is a heavily deforested area. Then you start looking at these trees, and these trees are patterns of carefully managed trunks, buds. These get a little bit bigger, and maybe a year or so they're going to be cut for firewood. But everyone has a whole principle of monitoring these fields and these bigger trees so you don't cut down the seed corn. Then if you get out and walk in this terrain, as many as you know, it is dusty, smelly, animal dung dust, human dung dust, dust. This is area that is heavily traversed, and this is an ecosystem that is basically at the edge of collapse, as empty as it looks. Very, very amazing photograph taken by a war photographer whose name escapes me for a moment. Over the hill here, there's an attack in a village, one of those linear attacks, and these are people fleeing to find cover. They go up a rise, and they're heading this way. If they're lucky, there's a wadi over here. Not much cover. So this gives you the conditions of hot pursuit and why flight in Darfur was so deadly. And if you look at these women, at least 3 of them are carrying babies. And one of the reasons flight is so dangerous for women is that they're encumbered by childcare and child responsibilities. In these high fertility areas, a woman is likely to be lactating, baby on back, toddler, or pregnant, or some combination of those factors. This slows them down. And we actually did an analysis talking to the refugees from these 3 towns and said, during attacks and during flight, what happened to you? And what we found is that there was very, very difficult experiences for many of them. Aerial bombing, killing of family members, shooting, and hearing racial epithets, but the point here is that the attack and the flight was a very deadly one. And when we asked people to reconstruct their family size, this is what basically survived. All these faded out ones are dead. And these are all the animals that were lost. So essentially what you have is a decimation of the family unit and of the livestock unit. And this is part of this basis that we were saying what was going on in Darfur was certainly killings, and certainly in some ways on an ethnic and tribal basis, but it was also a depletion of livelihoods, which is actually one of the elements of the Genocide Convention. So if we look at some other examples of Kosovo and Congo, I just would like to show you, this is a graphic that was taken from Les Roberts' studies of death in DRC. There's no geography here, but it does graphically give you a sense of who is killed, and it was in the New York Times. We helped make this graphic based on our work in Darfur, and it's been a very dramatic pictograph for people to understand patterns of current civil wars, that you die more from disease and migration than you do from actual bullet or machete woundings. This was an extremely good study that was done by Paul Spiegel and Peter Salama in Kosovo, looking at population and war-related morbidity and mortality after the brief but brutal war in Kosovo. And there was high contestation here about whether the NATO bombing had caused a lot of killing or whether it was the Serb forces. And it's a complicated story, but this is the main baseline. This is the red is the war-related deaths, and the other is other causes. KLA offensive began in the late summer, the intense offensive late summer of '98. NATO bombardment began in March of '09. Everybody left, but those who did not leave had a huge increase in the death rate. And it's in the text rather than in the graphic, but asked cause of death. Over 90% of these people said the cause of death was Serbian attacks on them, not NATO bombing. And then we're familiar with HealthNet and the Global Disease Alert Map. And the reason I put this up here is that I get impatient with events put on a map without any understanding of the mechanism below it. As I said, adjacency in time and space doesn't necessarily mean relationships in fundamental cause. However, we know that disease is a communicable problem. This is an infectious disease map. And so clusters are by definition an identification of a disease outbreak. So a map like this, if we're dealing with infectious and communicable disease, has deep meaning. It's the same way that the Broad Street Pump graphic has deep meaning. But you could have another map up here, which essentially was all the wars that have broken out. It doesn't tell you very much, because this kind of depiction does not get at what the underlying factors were. So my point about bringing it here is that this kind of depiction, which is what we're starting to do quite a lot in crisis mapping, is meaningful only in certain kinds of conditions, because it has to reflect an underlying web of connectedness, which is what our next set of work involves. So this is summary. You've been very patient, but essentially we think in rules and patterns. We simplify in order to understand and move forward. Patterns are one way of simplifying, and we think best in terms of departures from expected patterns. Visualization is an extremely helpful way to address this mode of thinking and our mode of moving forward through complex data sets. And that although there's almost infinite complexity in the data, the infinite, almost infinite, can be addressed by the computer power that we now have. But then we need human experience and knowledge to, out of that a massive data, acquire a sense of meaning and patterns and indicators and metrics that will allow us to say we now understand better our world because of these new tools that have accreted and been developed by people like you. So thank you very much.